Good evening, and welcome to our public hearing to discuss tax increment financing, commonly referred to as TIFs. I am Columbus City Councilmember Emmanuel Remy and currently serve as chair of the Economic Development Committee. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize my council colleagues, Council President Shannon Hardin and Councilmember Shayla Faber. Thank you for coming this evening. I would like to thank everyone for their work and preparation for today's discussion, including our speakers, Mike Stevens, the Interim Director of the Department of Development, and Megan Kilgore, Columbus City Auditor. And a special thank you to all members of the public for taking the time to join us this evening as we engage in this discussion. I would like to remind everyone that there will be an opportunity to provide public testimony. If you'd like to do so, please fill out a speaker slip located near the council chamber exit or next to the front security desk. But if you're already here, you might as well do it here. Each speaker will be limited to 3 minutes, and we will accept speaker slips until the end of the presentation. The purpose of this public hearing is to learn about what tax increment financing is, how it works, and why we use this economic development tool in the city of Columbus. This will then lead us to TIF ordinances coming before council Monday, December 9th and Monday, December 16th. There are several of them which we'll go into a little bit greater detail this evening. Since I became chair of this committee, it has been my intent to increase the level of transparency that we have when it comes to doing these types of economic deals. And to do so, sometimes these things can be quite complicated. And so I feel that we have an obligation to explain to the public the basics of things like TIFs and many other types of development tools that we utilize here in the city of Columbus. So wanted to take the opportunity tonight, in light of several pieces of legislation coming forth, to take up the opportunity to explain TIFs in greater detail, but we'll continue to do this as we move through the number of tools that we have at our disposal to make sure that Columbus is growing and to also make sure that our values as a body, the Columbus City Council, are being represented throughout the deals that we put forth. Tax increment financing can be a very challenging topic. This is why this hearing is so important. We feel that being as transparent as possible and hearing feedback from those who live, work, and raise families in the city of Columbus is very important to the legislative process. And because of our residents, we empower the administration to bring forth the best possible deals for the city of Columbus and the residents it serves. We have also been clear, very clear, about our values and have made sure that they are reflected in every piece of legislation that comes before this body. We are excited about these upcoming projects because they bring much needed resources for Columbus residents, including affordable housing, senior housing, living wage jobs, office space for growing businesses, and new opportunities for small retail and restaurant businesses. We'll get right into the speakers, and I'm going to call on Interim Director Stevens. Can you begin your remarks by discussing what tax increment financing is, how it works, and why they are used in the city of Columbus?
Thank you, Chair Remy, President Hardin, members of council. Tax increment financing, or TIFs, is an infrastructure financing tool available to local governments in Ohio to finance infrastructure improvements that support commercial development and, in certain circumstances, residential rehabilitation. TIFs provide an exemption from the increased assessed value of improvement to real property associated with commercial development projects. The funds that would have been paid to the jurisdiction which enacted the TIF are subsequently placed in a development fund to finance the construction of infrastructure defined within the TIF legislation and TIF agreement. It is important to note that the property taxes on the real property values existing before the enactment of the TIF, or the base value, continues to be collected and distributed to the taxing entities that levied them. Disbursements from the TIF reimburses the entity that made the infrastructure improvements over time. This includes both the private developer and/or the city. If the TIF continues to generate revenue beyond the projects, infrastructure costs, the revenue remains with the city and can be used for additional TIF-eligible infrastructure projects needed to spur private development, job growth, and maintain our sufficiency of public infrastructure within the TIF district. The maximum term of a TIF exemption is 30 years, and the maximum percentage exemption is 100%. The TIF exemption commences with the tax year after the effective date of the TIF legislation in which the increased real property value first appears on the tax list and duplicate. We talk about two different types of TIFs, and that's some of the legislation you have before you tonight. We'll get into more detail, but there are 0.40 TIFs, which are only able to reimburse for public improvements in the public right-of-way, such as roads, highways, water and sewer lines, sidewalks, public parks, parking lots, and parking structures. In addition to the public improvements that are eligible under 0.40 TIFs, 0.41 TIFs allows for all public improvements associated with the 0.40 TIFs, as well as private improvements with the development. In order to use a 0.41 TIF, the city or municipality must be or have been in the chain of title of the property within the TIF. The City of Columbus, when we do TIFs within the Columbus School District, we make the school districts whole. So that means the schools will receive their full portion of property tax revenue generated by the TIF district. Any TIFs created where the schools are not made whole must be negotiated with and approved by the school board where the TIF area is located. So once again, I will emphasize that within the Columbus City School District, we do non-school TIFs, so the schools are made whole in what they would have received from that TIF. TIFs are a benefit to the community because they pay for the cost of public infrastructure improvements needed to spur private development and job growth or maintain the sufficiency of the public infrastructure in the area of private development. The property owners are sharing in the cost of infrastructure improvements benefiting their TIF district. Furthermore, these investments relieves pressure on the city's capital and general fund budgets and stimulates development or redevelopment that would not occur without the TIF structure being in place. So the City of Columbus currently has 74 TIFs in place. Our first one we did out in Easton in 1996. I'll just talk through a couple of the TIFs that are in place and the benefits we see as a community. One of the recent ones that was approved was the West Goodale 0.41 TIF, where White Castle has recently opened their new headquarters and has spurred a mixed-use development. We've seen 90,000 square feet of corporate headquarters built, 50,000 square feet of additional office building, and 250 residential units are under construction. So the TIF-funded improvements include the Goodale Connector, the 315 exit ramp, green space, bike trails, and other public infrastructure surrounding the site. While not all those projects have been completed yet, they will be eligible to be reimbursed when that happens. In 2007, Whirlpool chose Columbus as a new location for one of their national distribution centers. The $160 million investment resulted in construction of a 1 million square foot warehouse and a distribution facility and 200 new jobs. In 2017, an additional 1.5 million square feet of industrial warehouse was constructed on the site, which will house a new Quaker distribution facility. So we created the Rickenbacker West 0.40 TIF back in 2007, and that funded the public infrastructure needed to support these developments. The TIF has funded specifically the reconstruction of Shook Road, improvements to Bego Street, and will pay for improvements to the Shook Road and State Route 317 intersection in the Rickenbacker Inland Port area. In the early 2000s, development in the Hayden Run corridor began under the Pay As We Grow program. Pay As We Grow established a plan for funding public improvements that included the creation of 2 new TIFs. The Hayden Run North and South TIFs were established to assist in funding public infrastructure, parks, schools, and other public services to accommodate growth for the area. So some of the funded improvements include, numerous projects in the area, the extension of Hayden Run Boulevard, Phase 1, and the recently completed Hayden Run Phase 2 project, which had a bridge and a roadway, as well as some parkland. So to date, the Hayden Run North and South TIFs have generated more than $15 million in funding. And in the early 2000s, the city, in partnership with the Northland community, led successful redevelopment of Northland Mall and the Morse Road corridor into a multi-use area that includes a new Kroger, Menards, Franklin County Jobs and Family Services offices, dog shelter, and the Ohio Department of Taxation. The Northland and Morse Road TIFs were created to help fund infrastructure and development costs, including utility improvements, roads, sidewalks, streetscape improvements, acquisition of real estate, and site preparation. Currently, the Morse Road TIF is funding the replacement of a stream culvert and new sidewalks along Sinclair Road from Morse Road to Strimple Road. We also created the East Broad Street and Wagoner Road TIFs. This helped address some of the traffic congestion and infrastructure improvements along East Broad Street. And then we're going to be talking about a number of TIF areas we're going to be creating within the Arena District. It's important to note that over 20 years ago when we created the initial TIFs for the Arena District, it was a vacant and abandoned penitentiary. And we have used those dollars to help see that change from a vacant site to a significant job center in our community. Projects funded through the TIF in the Arena District includes the improvements to Nationwide Boulevard, John McConnell Boulevard, Neal Avenue, Spring Street, Front Street, including the improvements to streetscapes, utility relocations, streetlights, and sidewalks. So out in the Arena District, we've seen $1.9 billion in public and private investment. We've seen the creation of over 12,000 jobs in the Arena District and over 2,000 residential properties. So these are the strategic investments we're using TIFs to continue to grow and fuel the development and the prosperity of our community.
Thank you very much, Director. I know in doing a little research that I asked from your department that TIFs were first authorized by the state in 1976, correct?
Correct.
And there's over 1,800 of them throughout the state. So we have 74 here in the city of Columbus. So just to give a little perspective on, how these are utilized, throughout the state of Ohio. Are there any questions or comments from my colleagues at this point? All right, go ahead. Councilmember Faber.
Thank you for your presentation, Director Stevens. You've acknowledged a few times .40 and .41. To what are you actually referring to?
Thank you. That's a good clarification. The Ohio Revised Code gives the municipality corporations the ability to create tax increment finance districts. 5709.40 of the Ohio Revised Code and 5709.41 of the Ohio Revised Code is the enabling legislation we use. So I appreciate the ability to give that clarification.
And you acknowledge that the TIFs that we use in Columbus do not affect the schools, correct? They are made whole?
We have made within the Columbus City School District, the TIFs that we are creating are non-school TIFs, and they are made whole and they get the revenue they would have received.
Every year?
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Faber. I appreciate your initial testimony tonight, Director. I'm going to turn now to Auditor Kilgore. Interim Director Stevens just spoke to why tax increment financing, or TIFs, are used as an economic development tool in the city of Columbus. Could you speak to the use and benefits of TIFs from the perspective of the city auditor?
Sure, Chair Remy, Council President Hardin, and Councilwoman Faber. I'll share a little bit about our office's responsibility and role with TIFs. First of all, we collect the revenues, and so in the property tax settlements, the TIF revenues for each of the city's revenue-producing TIFs, and not all the TIFs are quite yet revenue-producing, but those that are come into our office and we receipt them in, deposit them into the funds with the development department's guidance. We also look at risk mitigation, and meaning how to best mitigate the City of Columbus's financial exposure while still trying to get the development that we wish to see done. And we look at the overall financial consequences of various economic development tools. And the fact is, a city of our size, and given the tools that both our state of Ohio as well as our city has afforded our development department, tools are one of the many, many, many acronyms in Director Stevens' toolbox. One of the things that I really, as an auditor, like about TIFs, and I'm kind of putting on my professor hat a little bit, is that the City of Columbus, and Councilman Faber, you asked a great question about our TIFs. We've always taken a really vanilla approach. A lot of cities around the country do not make their schools whole. For me, with a growing Columbus City Schools, that I think is one of the most important foundations in our city, I am so proud and pleased that the City of Columbus has always maintained a commitment to funding our schools 100%, our Columbus City Schools, out of our TIF projects. That's really important for me as a citizen as well. What I like about TIFs as an economic development tool, you did a great job, Director, of explaining how they work. I really appreciate their usefulness, and I'm going to kind of give a bit of an adage from Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. TIFs, if the developer develops the TIF to a sizable degree, then the developer will be able to utilize the revenues that TIF produces to fund additional projects. And that is completely a benefit to the city because it does not come out of our capital plan. And the best examples I can give watching, and frankly, we're all keeping on top of population growth as best we can, but with a sizable growing population, our capital plan remains very, very important for just our maintenance of our existing populations, let alone our growth. TIFs are a great way to keep those new economic development projects going without having to get in the way of our really crucial, frankly, very practical projects that we always need to have done. And the good examples that I can give are Easton and Polaris. I remember I was not quite here at that point in the 90s, but if you think about Polaris and Easton, at one point they were both relatively flat cornfields. They were big dreams, but they weren't anything that were absolutely certain. They were big ideas. And TIF, let's take Easton for example. A TIF was a great way for that developer to be able to responsibly build up the development and reap the benefits of being able to kind of at their speed continue to run new infrastructure, new roads, new sidewalks, new streetlights out without having economic consequence to the City of Columbus. And that's a really good tool. But again, the best way I can explain it is if they build it, they get to generate additional TIF revenues, which will allow them to further get into repaying themselves. Largely, most of our economic development program with TIFs has taken the form of a reimbursement agreement. And so basically, let's take Easton again. They started getting the shovel in the ground. They built the roads. You can't just bring in all these office buildings and retail and restaurants without having infrastructure. So they did the infrastructure, and then they were able to reimburse themselves out of the TIF revenues as they were produced. So it gives you a little bit of hopefully a little flavor for why I'm a big fan of the way that the City of Columbus executes our TIF program. It's vanilla, it's worked for us, the schools are made whole, and I like that universal approach that stayed true from kind of start to finish. With respect to another point regarding these larger economic development areas like the Eastons, the Arena District that you've alluded to, Polaris, in the City of Columbus's history, we've only had 5 years since 1948 of collecting income tax, 5 negative years. 3 of those years have occurred since 2002. Auditor Dorian made public comments, and I remember this very well too. The critical success of the City of Columbus during what was the double-dip recession, very difficult time for us financially, were those 3 epicenters of jobs: Polaris, Easton, Arena District. Those offices, those office space, the buildings, those giant, kind of hubs for economic growth is what kept us afloat, even beyond the scope of our downtown office buildings and our workers during those double-dip recessions. And so I think, if you can't look around the country and see more successful TIFs than the ones I just mentioned to you right there. The burden is on the developer to grow it so that they can continue their vision and their plan. And the benefit is the City of Columbus has really, I'm going to say, the driver's seat, though, when it comes to determining the projects and types of projects those TIFs support. So we are not losing control over that, which I think is a point that the director made as well. We're still very much in the driver's seat. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of a little taste for my sentiments, but happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Auditor. Do any of my colleagues have any questions at this time? All right. Thank you very much, Madam Auditor. We'll move back to the Director. There will be 7 ordinances coming before Council before the end of the year relative to tax increment financing. Interim Director Stevens, could you discuss each of these ordinances and why Council's consideration is being requested?
Yes, thank you, Chair Remy, President Harder, members of Council. I'm going to just start going through each one and giving a little background on those. The first ordinance is 3009-2019. That's to create the Grandview Crossing TIF. Grandview Crossing is going to be a 0.41 TIF, and it's going to, we're using this as a strategic investment tool to drive a mixed-use development that will consist of 200,000 square feet of Class A office space, 900 residential apartment units with 20% set aside for affordable units, 260 senior living units, 120 key hotel, and 29,000 square feet of retail space. If there's any, oh, I'm sorry.
Director, did you say 0.41 for that Grandview
Grandview Crossing is 0.41, correct. Once again, this will be a non-school TIF. The schools will be made whole, and we will reimburse the developer and reimburse ourselves for our infrastructure expense. I'd be happy to answer any questions on this ordinance, or I can just keep on going.
Why is this one being categorized under the 0.41 statute?
There's some, as we've negotiated with the developer, there's some on-site improvements, private improvements that can be captured and be reimbursed under the 0.41 statute. So we've worked through and included that. So all the public improvements as well as some private site improvements can be done on that.
And can you give some examples of what those are private improvements might include?
So that's going to be, typically it's going to be some of the on-site, like stormwater work is example for that. Some of their parking facilities on-site will be used. It's also typically, it's usually those projects that benefit the specific development and not the public infrastructure serving outside of the public.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Council President Harden.
Thank you, Chair. Director, are you aware of any additional ask from the developer to the city in terms of infrastructure that the TIF would not support?
I'm not aware of that, no. I don't believe that is the case. We know that we're always trying to find ways to improve the infrastructure and the traffic system out there. So as we continue to do studies and develop it, there might be, but I'm not aware of any at this time.
But to your statement just a second ago, those would be for publicly facing, public use infrastructure improvements, not those that would be directly, specifically beneficial to the development.
And typically we negotiate these dollars to be used to pay for those in an order, so we can also, the benefit will be received by the community in using those dollars to pay that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director. You can move on then to
Thank you.
3166.
The next ordinance is 3166, 2019. This is one of the 4 ordinances where we're creating new TIF areas within the Arena District. For all 4 of those areas, I'm going to kind of summarize some of the economic development benefits that have driven us or have motivated us to bring this forward and use this as a strategic investment tool. We estimate that the city will receive a total cash benefit of approximately $167 million over the life of the agreement. We've also, through negotiations with the developer, have ensured that the reimbursement of $17 million in outstanding Arena District infrastructure expenses that the city has already incurred will be paid. Out of that $17 million, $4.5 million will be used to create a maximum annual debt service reserve fund to support the city's debt guarantee for Hilton 2.0. Why this is important is this will remove the need for the city to annually hold $4.5 million from the city's capital budget and reserve. So by using the dollars that are generated from this 0.40 TIF in 3166, it will go originally, first to the city to develop that reserve fund of $4.5 million, which on an annual basis will free up those dollars available for the city to make capital investments in our parks, in our neighborhoods, in our communities. All the TIFs that we're doing in the Arena District are non-school TIFs. We anticipate with these new TIF areas that the schools are going to receive a benefit of approximately $109 million over the term of these agreements. So development within the restructured TIFs will contribute to the total $1 billion in new investment that we're going to see in the Arena District over the next 20 years. So we expect that's going to result in 3,200 new jobs and generate $6.5 million in new income tax revenue. Within these specific TIF areas that Council is reviewing this December, we're looking at 500 to 600,000 square feet of new Class A office space, 2,200 jobs, and $4 million in new income tax revenue. So that's the TIF areas in the Arena District as a whole. This specific ordinance, 3166, 2019, will create two new TIF districts under Section 5709.40 of the Ohio Revised Code. The new TIF areas will include the Marriott AC project and the North Market project. As .40 TIFs, the proceeds generated will only be used to reimburse the developer or the city for costs related to public infrastructure improvements. I'd be happy to answer any questions regarding that ordinance.
Do either of you have any questions in regards? Council President Harden.
Thank you again, Chair. And maybe this is to the auditor. The director spoke about the Hilton 2.0 project, and I don't know if you said, Director, specifically under 3166, but definitely in this group of TIFs that we're discussing now, that this would free up approximately $4.5 million from our capital budget. Can you explain what that means, why and how that got in here, into these TIFs, and why that's important?
Sure, Council President Harden. The Hilton 2.0, while the project and actually the bonds are issued by the Franklin County Convention Facilities Authority, because the Hilton it's a unique credit to try and take to Wall Street. What they did is they tried to figure out how much they could use the hotel revenues to maximize a self-supporting credit, and then try and figure out the best way to financially optimize the remainder. And the best way that they could come up with was to ask the city and the county to do something that is very similar to co-signing a mortgage. In the event that, to try and get a better credit on Wall Street, the city and the county are saying, we're back in this project, and it's called a backstop, kind of informally, but it's no different than, Councilman Remy, you perhaps co-signing your kid's future mortgage. And so therefore, it's on your credit report. And one of the things that I spent a lot of time talking with each of you about was the concern that I frankly had about that requirement pursuant to the city charter, where we would have to pledge funds on an annual basis every single January, just as you do now with the convention center. You'd have to take those funds and make sure that you splice them away, that in the event that you're called, you would be there to support this project. And the concern that I had was, really, especially last year was a tough economic year. Would that be eating up capacity that you could otherwise be using for public service or other projects? And when previous Development Director Shoney was here, I went to him with kind of an idea. This kind of the reorganization of these TIFs, which is pretty customary. I feel like a lot of big developments, Polaris East and Arena District, kind of get re-upped about every 10 years because development just shifts. But it was a good opportunity because of the geographical proximity of the Arena District TIFs to the new Hilton Hotel, as well as, frankly, their self-support to one another. The folks that are going to be staying at the Hilton are going to be walking over and dining in the restaurants and so forth. And so I kind of had this idea and worked it through the city attorney's office to make sure it was going to be satisfactory for the city's charter, and went to the director and asked him to consider, as part of the negotiations, including as simply what I call an internal reserve fund. And so he was very agreeable to that, and that absolves council from having that same year financial commitment. It's a really good thing. And so basically the first $4.5 million, even though your final product for the Hilton is not quite that much, the first $4.5 million will come to the city, and we're going to set it aside, and that's going to serve as that reserve coverage. And so you're not going to have the funds on an annual basis. You're going to be able to still use them, and that's a really good thing. So appreciate you clarifying that. It's really unique. To the best of my knowledge, we've not done it before, but again, because of the geographical proximity, it made a lot of sense, and I'm glad that the former development director saw it favorable as well.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Auditor, and thank you for, because I remember when we talked about Hilton 2.0, that being one of your concerns, so I appreciate the thought and the work that was done to make sure that debt was lifted off of our books. Will there be a gap between the 4.5 being collected and the Hilton 2.0 coming on, where we will still have that annual debt? What would that look like?
Thank you, Council President. No. In fact, the discussions with the Convention Facilities Authority all along, that was a number that I felt should be a ceiling. And so the plan was to never issue more in the city's portion than that would cover. And so the short answer is no. As a result of favorable market conditions, as well as, frankly, you have to, working through the rating process, the CFA was able to maximize the amount of bonds that the Hilton itself can support, therefore reducing some of the city and county's portion. The portion to the city and the county is less than is less than the $4.5 million. So we will actually, we're well within our constraints.
Thank you very much, Madam Auditor and Council President Harden. Councilmember Faber.
Thank you. Madam Auditor, can you please explain how we're able to estimate what the cash benefit of $167 million is? Where do those numbers come from?
The $167 million, that's a great question. That would be something from the Department of Development, so I'm afraid I have to share over there.
Great, thank you for the question. The 167 breakdown includes the 17 million that we're going to get reimbursed. It includes the number of years of when the 6.5 million per year in income tax revenue that's going to be created. So we're including the direct payments we're receiving for reimbursement from the TIF, as well as some of the income tax revenue that is generated to the site.
And how long does it take, or are we estimating it will take for these TIFs to be actually generating revenue in order to start producing these type of numbers?
The great thing about an incentive like this is the developer, it's to their benefit to be putting in and making these projects happen and building these office spaces so they can get reimbursed for the infrastructure investments they've already made and some of the already and what they will make. So we anticipate that this is going to happen at a fairly significant rate. We're hoping it's going to be even faster, but we know we have projects like the Chipotle headquarters that is being developed and will benefit these TIF districts. So we anticipate it's going to happen quickly and definitely see a significant, I have a number here. So we know that over the term of the 30 years, the school districts, we're estimating they're going to get $109 million from these TIF areas. From only these TIF areas, we expect that we're going to get about $43.7 million in the non-school going to this area. So it's going to take probably 2 to 3 years to start ramping up. We'll start seeing significant revenue after that.
Thank you, Councilwoman Faber. Just to chime in, one thing that I think is worth noting with these particular TIFs is that they're mature. And so while the former development director was really the architect of the meetings, I did sit in on several of the meetings. The this isn't a new project or projects there, so I would just add some additional color in that these TIFs have been around since '98. And so when you ask about those projections, what Director Stevens is referencing are largely the valuations that are already online. And so when we were working through some of the Hilton, the MADs, the Debt Service Reserve Fund projections, those numbers assumed relatively little growth so that we had some certainty, but they're baked in. Most of those TIFs there are very mature, with the exception of what I will call the Boone development, the stuff that's yet to come online, which can be projected but very conservatively right now. But for the city's portion of this Hilton piece, we are only utilizing, frankly, the development that is live, mature, and we feel very comfortable that those dollars will come in for us.
So for the current TIFs, are they performing as originally contemplated?
No, much, much better. Much better. TIFs,
A district?
please?
In the Arena District?
Yeah, I'm really speaking to what I call the two original TIFs and the Arena District. That's what really built the site that we know as the Arena District. They have been hyper successful. The city too, we've talked only about the developers, benefiting from TIF revenues, but the city of Columbus also utilizes TIFs cooperatively and collaboratively with our developments and developers to best produce the projects that we feel are very important. And so what Director Stevens referenced in that $17 million figure are actually projects that precede any of us, to the best of my knowledge, in City Hall. This goes back to an agreement from 1999 where we helped, frankly, we said, Arena District, you get these projects underway, and we're going to go ahead and issue some bonds, which the City of Columbus did as our traditional capital general obligation type projects, all in largely public transportation, as I recall. But we said if the TIFs ever reach a fruition, a maturity where we can repay ourselves, we want that to happen. That's something that I felt very personally, strongly about when Director Shoney was working on these, because that being all public service money is all special income tax money. That's the absolute, heart of our city's finances. Mm-hmm. That's where we pay for pretty much everything with the exception of our utilities. And so being able to repay ourselves for development that we frankly did 2000s through late 2000s will be really good for our additional capital projects in all of Columbus.
Thank you.
Sure.
Director, on the .40 TIFs, I know that you've asked us to put this on emergency. Can you explain a little bit about why there's a beneficial arrangement for the city of Columbus to have this particular TIF, this particular piece of legislation be passed on emergency?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Remy. I appreciate Council's consideration of this as emergency, because as we've talked about, these .40 TIF dollars are going to go to establish that reserve fund. There is a project that's underway, the Marriott AC Hotel, that we want to be able to establish this TIF area this year so we can capture that incremental increase based on the development that has already occurred there to help speed up the funding of that reserve fund.
Thank you very much. Go ahead and move on to 3167.
3167 is another TIF district that's being created in the area. We call this Vine TIF Area 1. This would create a TIF district under Section 5709.41 of the Ohio Revised Code. The new TIF area is the Vine TIF Area 1, where the Chipotle headquarters will be developed. As a .41 TIF, the proceeds generated may be used for any purpose permitted under Section 5709.41 of the Ohio Revised Code.
Councilmember Favor.
Thank you. Director Stevens, so we are clear, some of the TIFs that are before council or will be before council are currently already operating, and they will be revised.
So in the Arena District, there's TIF districts in the Arena Districts. We are taking these parcels out of those existing districts and creating new TIF areas or new TIF districts for the new development or or investment in that parcel to capture that incremental increase. So, yes.
But if they're already performing well, to our auditor's point, why are we removing them from performing TIFs already in the district?
So most of these are parcels that are undeveloped. So we are capturing the new development and the incremental increase as a result of that development or investment in existing parcels that are significant enough that it's going to have an incremental increase in that, from that investment.
Council President Harden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director, you spoke about, for the last TIF, the 20/80 split. Could you talk about that again in terms of how the waterfall would work?
Yeah, as the agreement that lays out, the TIF reimbursement agreement talks about how the city is going to get reimbursed for the first $4.5 million to pay, to set up the reserve fund. And then the next tranche of dollars is going to come and split between the developer and the city at an 80-20% level. The developer is capped, and once the developer's reached its cap limit, the city will receive 100% of those funds to use for infrastructure improvements within the Arena District.
Okay.
Director, what is the cap on that?
It's $65 million.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions on this particular? All right, please proceed to 3168.
3168-2019 is a new TIF district that's we call the Old Dublin Road expansion. So this is the expansion of the Old Dublin Road TIF. It will go to support the extension of sanitary sewer and future roadway improvements in the Trabue Road corridor. This is a .41 TIF.
Any questions on that from my colleagues?
I'm sorry to go back here, but of the existing TIFs, are those all falling under the .40 category?
No, there's broken out between .41 and .40 TIFs. I'm assuming you mean in the Arena District?
Yes.
Yeah. They're broken down between .40 and .41. The auditor talked about like the two new TIFs or the two original TIFs that were created. And with those that were created back in 1998, the nationwide TIF ordinance and the Penn site TIF ordinance, one was a .40 TIF and one was a .41 TIF.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Can I actually go back as well? Can you speak about the uses of what can these TIFs be used for when you're
On the .40, it's very specific public improvement infrastructure, so roads, sidewalks, streetscape. Let me talk about what we've done in the Arena District with some of these .40 dollars. We've made improvements to Nationwide Boulevard. We've made significant widening improvements to Neal Avenue. And where that's important, not only does it benefit the Arena District and the job growth and investment we've seen there, but that benefits the network that we have that supports the downtown and moving people into the downtown job center as well as up towards the university. So these are critical investments that are important not only to the Arena District but to the city and our other job centers and key areas. So I kind of went off a tangent. I'll keep talking. On the .41, we're allowed to use all of those, public infrastructure improvements as well as those improvements on site for the project. I'm trying to think of a good example of that. .41, well, I'll put it this way. Based on the Ohio Revised Code, there's very limitation on what can be reimbursed on a .41 TIF. Is probably the best way to describe it, to encourage that job growth and development. And the requirement of the city being in the chain of title is the reason for that. It makes it a public improvement throughout the site.
Are we currently in chain of title of these parcels that are in consideration?
For the .41 TIFs, yes, we have been. Recently, council, I want to say last month, passed the one for the Vine Street one. We have been on the other ones because they're existing .41 TIFs.
And just to point out on this chain of title thing, it's somewhat of an archaic state requirement that the city, for a moment in time, take chain of title. It's actually something that we've discussed that potentially we should lobby our legislature to kind of alleviate that, because it's kind of Well, you can talk a little bit more about that, I think.
There can be some burdensome processes in that, so, yeah.
It creates more legislation that we have to pass. It's hard to figure out from a layperson's perspective really what it accomplishes in today's world. So I guess we can leave it at that. Any other questions on 3168? All right, great. Please proceed to 3169.
3169 is a new TIF district for what we're calling the Hyatt Regency TIF district. This is also a .41 TIF, and the proceeds generated from the new, we anticipate significant new investment at the Hyatt Regency that currently exists at the corners of Nationwide and High Street. Based on that new investment, if there's any incremental increase to the property tax that is generated, we'll capture that incremental increase, the non-school portion of that, into this TIF, .41 TIF fund.
Yeah, I believe that we're under the impression that they would renovate the Hyatt, especially once Hilton 2.0 comes online.
Yeah, I think one of the great things we're experiencing in Columbus now is the significant work that the community has done to grow our Convention and Visitor Bureau business, and that is a great location to serve that business and our guests and visitors coming in. So our understanding is, and there's going to be a significant investment to refresh that and make that, continue to make us competitive in the convention and business and attracting those opportunities.
Thank you. Any questions from my colleagues on that particular ordinance? All right, please proceed to 3170.
3170 will create a TIF district under Section 5709.41 of the Ohio Revised Code. We're calling this new TIF area Yeager TIF Area Number 2. It's a .41 TIF. We anticipate as a redevelopment of some mixed use and some office there. This is, if I get my geography right and my bearing, this is more on the southwest section of the Arena District, and going to be where we're going to see a lot of the expansion and growth of the Arena District with Confluence Village, and it's just south of there.
Okay. Any questions from my colleagues on that particular ordinance? All right, and then finally, please proceed to 3176.
3176, we're calling the Corey Trails TIF. This development will consist of 40,000 square feet of Class A office space, 600 residential apartment units with 10% set aside for affordable units, 440 single-family homes and condominiums, as well as 50,000 square feet of retail. A new 220-acre metro park in connection to the Columbus Regional Bikeway Network will also be included in this project.
Any questions for my colleagues on this one?
No, just questions in general.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you going through the legislation point by point this evening. Now we'll open it up to any further questions from my colleagues. Councilmember Faber.
Director, if we look at the agreement, the Economic Development Agreement, as it relates to the amendment of the TIFs, there's a notation that if requested by the developer, the city will cooperate on a blight study for the new TIF area created along the Vine Street and Goodell corridor. Can you speak about why that specific TIF was contemplated as potentially needing a blight study and what that could financially cost the city?
So that blight study has been done, and to set up, it's part of the creation of the .41 TIF and having chain of ownership. We need to, it's back to the kind of the rules of the Ohio Revised Code, and you need to, the cost was a limited staff time. We go out and it's a very low bar on identifying what blight is. So the parking lot that we were looking at, it would be, to be redeveloped, would be considered blight. That study was done. We brought that to City Council last month as part of the chain of title and acceptance of that blight study.
Okay, so since it's been designated as a blighted area, then it would qualify?
For the .41, correct.
Okay. And then the city's commitment to the public infrastructure improvements in the Arena District, what is that number?
I want to make sure I understand your question. We have committed to to reimburse the developer for their public infrastructure cost. We have capped that at $65 million. The allowable uses that this mechanism can provide for the reimbursement of past and future investments by both the city and the NRI are eligible for that. But like I said, it's for the developers capped at $65 million. If there's additional dollars that we identify to make roadway system improvements, we can use those dollars.
Okay. Is that inclusive of future public improvements?
So that's correct.
Okay.
So future public improvements to the site and around the Arena District, whether it's streetscape, road, water, sewer relocation, these dollars can be used to reimburse whether it's the city or the developer for that cost.
Okay. I just want to make sure I'm clear, because I think it's noting in the agreement that we'll pay $20 million towards future public improvement. Just wondering if it's two different numbers.
No, so in the economic development agreement, there's a there's a $20 million agreement that we're going to, over the next 5 years, commitment to reimburse the developer for public improvements that then will be reimbursed to the city from TIF proceeds.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair, Mayor.
Sure, go ahead.
Councilmember just brought up a question, and directors spoke about past and future uses for this fund. Can you give specific examples of what those past and future uses under this TIF would allow in this development?
So as we've worked through, and a lot of good work throughout by my colleagues at the Development Department on how do we best make the most efficient use of this mechanism, this TIF mechanism, for the reimbursement of past and future investments by both the city and the developer, in this case, Nationwide Realty. We agreed to expand the definition or what was allowable under .41, so it's everything that's allowed. We had limited what was allowable to be reimbursed under .41. That has been expanded to everything that's allowable under the Ohio Revised Code. So things like that and would include the some of the roadway improvements that I talked about earlier, whether Nationwide Boulevard, Neal Avenue. NRI can use that for some of their streetscape and sidewalk work that they've made investment on. It also can be reused. It can be used to pay down debt that has occurred for development within that district.
Thank you.
Any other questions? So we have no speaker slips, correct? All right, just wanted to make sure. That, for the most part, wraps up our presentation this evening, so definitely appreciate the time taken. I want to thank our speakers, Interim Director Mike Stevens and Auditor Megan Kilgore. I'd also like to thank Council President Hardin and Councilmember Favor for joining us this evening and supporting this evening. I want to recognize our CTV production team for helping us get this information out to those who cannot physically join us this evening. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank my team, Jeff Carter and Lucy Frank, as well as Matt Erickson, John Oswald, and Andrew Dyer from City Council Office of Legislative Research. And most importantly, I'd like to thank the community for your suggestions and feedback as we drew near this public hearing. This concludes our public hearing tonight. I appreciate everybody's support in coming down. Have a great evening.